Welcome, welcome, welcome everyone to this very special session of the New England Biography Series sponsored by the Massachusetts Historical Society. My name is Kenneth Horn, Wall Street Channel I. I'm the Director of Research here at the MHS. And before we go any further, I have to thank the members of the steering committee for this seminar series. They work tirelessly to bring serious and creative discussions about biographies and the craft of biography to our community. So I just want to thank Professors Megan Marshall, Julie Dobrow, and of course our presenter today, Natalie Dykstra. Thank you for all you do for the MHS. After my introductory remarks today, Dr. Dykstra will speak for about 35 minutes about her book. She will then be joined in conversation by the president of the MHS, Dr. Catherine Allgor, on stage. And we shall reserve about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. If you are in the room, just raise your hand and one of our staff members will come to you with a microphone. There will also be a book signing after this program concludes here. We ask that you remain seated in the room while our author gets her signing pen ready for a few seconds. The New England Biography Series is part of the lineup of programs organized by the research department at the MHS. And most of these sessions and the 6 other series revolve around pre-circulated papers that are works in progress. This series, however, is different in that it generally revolves around works that have already been completed. And each program in the series engages biographers in deep conversations about their subjects as well as about the craft of biography. And it is very fitting that we are holding this program in Ellis Hall at the MHS. Dr. Dykstra began research for this book, Chasing Beauty, in this very room. The project thus comes full circle from the very start of opening that first box full of documents to talking about this remarkable monograph. And now it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest this evening, Dr. Natalie Dykstra. She is also the author of Clover Adams, A Gilded and Heartbreaking Life, also researched here at the MHS. Dr. Dykstra received a 2005 fellowship from the National Endowment for the Humanities for her work on Clover Adams, and a 2018 NEH Public Scholar Award for the book we are here to discuss today. She also received the inaugural Robert and Ina Caro Fellowship sponsored by the Biographers International Organization for Chasing Beauty. She has been an honorary fellow of the Massachusetts Historical Society since 2011. Dr. Dykstra is a senior research professor and professor emerita of English at Hope College and now lives in Waltham, Massachusetts. Dr. Dykstra.
Thank you so much. Wow. Wow. Is my mic on? Can you hear me okay? There we go. Thank you so much, Catherine. Wow. And to all who came and those joining us online, and to everyone here at the MHS who has organized this occasion. More on that in a moment. In these last weeks, I've returned to the notebooks I filled to keep my bearings when a night such as this one seemed at a far distance. An entry dated May 17, 2022 reads, "What is my task? To tell the truest story I can, be meticulous, stay grounded." Then I added like a warning, "Don't get lost." But of course I did get lost many times, as one does on long projects. I have quite a few thank yous to say tonight to people who are here for helping me through some of those moments. Thank you to my co-organizers of the biography series, of which tonight is part. Julie is joining online, and Megan Marshall is here. Megan changed my life almost 20 years ago when, after hearing me give a lecture on Clover Adams, she came up to me and said, "I want to introduce you to my editor, Deanne Ermey." It was an act of extraordinary generosity for which Megan is known. Deanne is here too. Your unwavering belief in me and in the beauty and sweep of Isabella's story made this book possible. Last year, Laura Rockefeller, and her theatrical cast performed her vivid reimagining of Clover Adams' story right here in this room, An Afternoon I Cherish. Shana McKenna, head archivist at the Gardner Museum, can spot Isabella's handwriting from across the room. Often she would say to me, "I think you should really take a look at this material," to which I always said, yes. She is the hero of this book. Tess Fredette, textile conservator, opened the galleries to my imagination very early in my work, and Lisa Feldman and Alexander Bush, my research assistant, joined me on Zoom last spring for what we came to call EndNote Camp. So many friends are here, from Waltham, from Hancock Church in Lexington. Thank you for your forbearance these last years. The team members from my husband's Long Life Auto Repair Shop in Waltham are here. I'm very grateful for how hard you work every day supporting us, especially during this time. I met my trainer, Matt Supple, every Tuesday morning. Build one good day, he would say, a motto for life and for writing. Naomi Gordon opened her heart and her homes to me and saved me on the darkest days by speaking the truth. A lot of my Dykstra family is here. My siblings, Ellen, Greg, and Stuart, and their families, including Don, Sabina, Sela, and Alec, came from far and near. My nephew Benjamin took a beautiful photograph of a window in Grace Church in New York, which I'll be showing you tonight. I've missed innumerable family gatherings and holidays. Thank you for your understanding. To my dear husband, Mike Bundy, without whom this book would not have been possible, his steady love changed me, and a treasured memory is of him reading drafts of chapters in the next room and saying, "Oh, babe, this is pretty good." Finally, a word about the MHS, this extraordinary Boston institution. 25 years ago, next month, I first saw in this room a collection of remarkable photographs taken in the early 1880s by Clover Adams, the wife of Henry Adams. I saw this, 3 women at sea. I had seen paintings with this composition and mood, but not a 19th century photograph. And so the search for her story began. There are several lines from that photograph to this moment, and one of them is this: for anyone who writes nonfiction, our stories are not possible without the expertise of librarians and archivists, and some of the very best work happens here, led by Catherine and her team, including those who arranged tonight's occasion: Kid, Cassie, Victoria, Carol, Olivia. Also thanks to Sarah and to Elaine. Brenda Lawson, you have my heartfelt thanks for your friendship all these many years. Peter Drummy, historian here at the MHS, spent hours sharing with me his knowledge of Henry Adams all those years ago, and now he organized the gallery show upstairs to accompany this occasion. I am proud to be an honorary fellow. Thank you. So enough about all of you. We're here to celebrate Isabella. Who was this remarkable woman? Someone who seemed to shimmer with an unknowable light. My favorite letter by Henry James to Isabella was his last one to her, dated April 20, 1914. Quote, "You shine out to me with undiminished interest, and in your splendid setting," he wrote, "of so much art and so much honor. I am your faithfulest and further back, now surely than anyone, old Henry James." I love how her friend compared her to a jewel in a setting. I had the great fortune of spending time with Isabella and her husband, Jack Gardner, these many years, and there is much to tell, but we only have an hour. So I'll begin with an overview of her life, tell you a bit of how I developed her story, and then read excerpts, leaving plenty of time for questions. She was born in 1840 in Manhattan, the oldest daughter of David and Adelia Stewart. Her father was a merchant who traded in Irish and Scottish linen. The family attended fashionable Grace Church at the bend of Broadway and 10th Street, a 10-minute walk from her nearby girls' school. The sketch to the right by another student is of high-ceilinged room where she studied, and I love that chandelier. In her 16th year, her parents took her to Paris, where she enrolled in a Protestant convent school. Her classmates were from around the world, but her closest friends were two girls from Boston, Helen Waterston, on the left, and Julia Gardner, whose older brother, Jack, would later come to Paris. A word about Helen. In Isabella's friendship album, you'll notice on the bottom left of the screen their signatures. We know who Julia was, but who is Helen? A brief search brought me to the MHS, where I first read through her vivid diaries that she kept from 1855 to 1858. Her pages comprise a witness of Belle that rhymes with the woman she would become. I will never forget the moment I turned the page, dated December 8, 1856. Here, Helen describes her first meeting with Isabella Stewart, a New York girl. There she is, I thought, a teenager. By the time Isabella returned to New York, she was already sophisticated, having seen much of the art of Paris, Florence, Rome, and able to speak and read its languages. In Milan, after seeing the private collection of Count Poldi Pezzoli, a home later transformed into a museum, she turned to a friend and said, if I ever have any money of my own, I'm going to build a palace and fill it with beautiful things. At 20, she married Jack Gardner, a son of wealthy Boston Brahmin families. His older brother, George, described him as handsome, quiet, sufficiently at ease with the ladies, someone who danced beautifully. Where Belle was fiery, Jack was calm. And he thought Belle was the most interesting woman he had ever met. Early on, the young couple suffered terrible tragedies. After her first pregnancy ended in a stillbirth, they welcomed a blue-eyed boy who was given his father's nickname, Jackie. In the waning weeks of the Civil War, Jackie died before his second birthday. It was a derailing grief, as if she'd been exiled from womanhood when so much of being a woman in that era was being a mother. She almost didn't make it. What saved her was overseas travel, to Europe first, but then to Egypt, India, the Holy Lands, and later an extended tour of Asia, including Japan, China, Cambodia. Here are two slides from two different travel albums that I love. You can see how she pressed flowers in the one. She meticulously documented her travels in these large leather-covered travel albums, 28 in all. During her 1874 trip down the Nile, she wrote diary entries in her album. Listen to the sound of her voice after seeing by moonlight the Luxor complex at Karnak, with its hundreds of columns inscribed by hieroglyphics, reaching to the sky. Listen, I never had such an experience, and I felt as if I never wanted to see anything again in this world, that I might shut my eyes to keep that vision clear. It was not beautiful, but grand, mysterious, solemn. I felt it even more than saw it. By the 1880s, she and Jack had established a regular routine of travel in Europe every 2 years, tours which ended with a long stay in Venice, often at the Palazzo Barbaro on the Grand Canal. Most of her letters she consigned to bonfires, asking others to do likewise, though once she became the famous Mrs. Jack, some people, thankfully, defied her wishes. The letters that survive are full of speedy sentences and wit and warmth. She's particularly adept at setting the scene, as in this description of Hong Kong at sunset in 1883. Quote, "The clear-cut hills were every color, from bright red, pink, orange to pale blue, all reflected in the water. Then the light faded, night came slowly, and one by one, the stars in the heavens, in the still water, and in the city came out, and it was all a twinkle." I love the pace of this 1906 letter when she was in Paris. Quote, "I'm sitting by my high-up window overlooking the Tuileries Gardens where a band is playing. Weather still cool and fresh. I saw Henry Adams yesterday and was with him in his auto all afternoon, seeing old cathedral glass and motoring through Versailles. These motor cars do cover the ground." Isabella loved to move fast. She was athletic, a fast runner, and spun across the dance floor. She loved speedy horses and buggy rides. She was not very tall, but she filled a room. She listened with great intensity, and people commented on her low, melodic voice. She had a remarkable memory for what she heard and saw, and had an equally terrible temper. But her capacity to enjoy was life-giving, whether it was travel or grubbing in the earth. And these are extraordinary pictures of her Japanese and Italian gardens in Brookline. Or raising puppies. Also saving was her curiosity. She spent her 30s and 40s getting educated. She studied Italian to read Dante. She attended lectures given by Charles Eliot Norton at Harvard. She invited scholars and writers and musicians for dinner. She first collected clothing and jewelry, what was near at hand for a woman of her social class. I love this image of her with her pearls. And there's more about her fashion when I read from a chapter. Henry James teased her not to spend all her money on dresses, and soon enough, on the advice of Norton, she turned to collecting rare books. She was gathering her forces, preparing and expanding and learning all the time. She and Jack began buying artwork in the 1870s by the French Barbizon painters, and their homes were full of treasures. These images by the architectural photographer Thomas Marr depict the Gardner home at 152 Beacon Street, and you can see a through line from these rooms to her museum galleries later. By the time she bought Vermeer's The Concert in Paris in 1892, she had trained her eye. More about this purchase later, too. That year, she had inherited money from her father's estate, and a rush of collecting followed. She surely had help from the art dealer Bernard Berenson and others when buying this wondrous Rembrandt self-portrait. On the arrival of her Velázquez portrait of King Philip IV in Boston, she giddily wrote to Berenson, "His Majesty is here." She put arguably her greatest masterpiece of her collection, Titian's The Rape of Europa, in her red drawing room on Beacon Street near the fireplace. Just think of that. It was becoming increasingly clear to both Isabella and Jack that something had to be done to keep the collection secure. On a snowy night in late 1898, Jack Gardner collapsed from a stroke and died at the age of 61. Now Isabella's path to realizing her vision, a house with beautiful things, was marked by grief. Again. But she persisted. Securing a large parcel of land not a month later, plans were soon drawn up by her architect, Willard T. Sears. She knew she was taking a terrible risk. What she was attempting to do was sui generis. She fought with the city about its regulations. She had trouble keeping a skilled work crew. She had sleepless nights about money. And yet, there she is on a ladder inspecting the work crew. There's delight in her missives to Berenson, describing how she frequently went to the work site to oversee its innumerable crises and details, bringing along her lunch pail. As the century turned, the large palace with its plain exterior rose up on the marshland of the Fenway. Inside its 4 stories was a lush interior courtyard ringed by 3 stories of galleries and topped by a glass roof. Her singular accomplishment, a Venetian-style palazzo turned inside out, was filled room after room, not only with paintings, but tapestries, prints, porcelain, statues, manuscripts, stained glass, and fine furniture. She secured her vision by stipulating in her will that her installation of the galleries never be changed. Fenway Court, as the museum was known in its day, was open to the public in the winter of 1903, almost 40 years after the birth of her son Jackie. The responses of her first visitors were many and rapturous. I particularly love William James, who enthused how deeply moved he was by, quote, the aesthetic perfection of all things, unquote. I remember the wow the first time I went to the Gardner Museum more than 20 years ago. I was deep in my research for my first book on Clover Adams. I'd been dreading writing about her death by suicide and needed some cheering up. Sitting on a bench, looking into the soaring space of the museum's central courtyard, abloom with flowers, I mused, oh, to write about Isabella, someone so embracing of life, fierce and fearless. Isabella's story has been told, of course, but earlier biographies and depictions of her somehow never quite matched the soulfulness of the museum itself, of the intimate feeling in the galleries, or of its astonishing sweep and the largeness of its spiritual claim. I'd long been interested in photograph albums and other memory keeping by women in the 19th century, and I started to wonder if the galleries in Fenway Court could be understood even in part as a kind of 3-dimensional album. So instead of paging through an album, one walks through the rooms of a palace. She intended a visitor to move through the rooms in sequence, from the early Italian room to the high Renaissance of the Raphael room on the left, then to the intimacy of an 18th century French salon, and so on to the chapel at the end of the 3rd floor gallery and its large stained glass window. When the sun shines, jewel-like reds and blues pool on the stone floor. A few years later, I made this note in my journal. The way one moves from space to space, this happens, then this, all of it suggests a sequence, a narrative, like a poem or a story. In other words, can objects be eloquent like words? Can and do they testify? Henry Adams once said a biographer faces 2 kinds of challenges, too few sources about a subject or too many, and Isabella's archive has both challenges at once. There is far less documentation of her early years, her friendship album, her drawing book, and she says in the corner, "This is done very badly." The Stewart family window at Grace Church, put up by her parents in 1883 in memory of her 3 younger siblings. It's in New York. A sketch from Jack while they were courting. Notice the arrow through the heart. I had the feeling sometimes I was weaving her story from gossamer threads, a detail here, a mention in the diary there, but all of it mattered. I laughed out loud when I first saw this envelope that reads, "Mrs. Gardner, Esquire, well-known lady in high life." The postmaster wrote, "Try Mrs. Jack." And obviously the letter arrived. Then, by the time she was collecting her masterpieces in the 1890s, I had the opposite challenge, a deluge of material, reams of dealer files and museum subject files, her 28 travel albums, 17 guest books, large gallery cases filled with letters and other memorabilia, Jack's diaries, Isabella's innumerable lists. She even titled a large leather-bound notebook, "List of Things for the Museum." Notice the paintings she lists. Europa, the portrait of Rembrandt. I like the 4 Whistlers and 1 Delacroix. And then, of course, there are the 7,500 pieces of art, 3,000 rare books, and 1,000 plus correspondence. I guess it's no wonder I wrote in my journal, "Don't get lost." So I want to conclude with brief excerpts, and I promise they're brief, from 3 chapters. The first from the chapter called Dazzling, 1889, about the front stage and backstage of her character. The second from the concert in 1892 about the purchase of her Vermeer, and then from the end of the prologue when John Singer Sargent comes to Fenway Court to paint her last portrait. If Isabella was going to be in the spotlight, she needed something to wear. She had kept her figure for couture fashion and understood how fabric could catch the candlelight and which shapes and cuts flattered her. She was said to glide across a room like a boat on calm seas. The cut of her dress only amplified this graceful effect. And of course, she had Charles Frederick Worth, couturier to European courts, as her principal dressmaker. At about this time, Isabella asked him to make a riding coat popularized by Marie Antoinette, and this is at the Penn Museum nearby, or Peabody Essex Museum. The waist measures 28 inches. The fabric, a plush midnight blue velvet, absorbs the light, even as elaborate beading of pale blues and pinks shines and glisten. Isabella understood fashion as a language, a way she could put herself on display and signal what she did not say. Look at me, I'm important, I have power. This is female power in the old European sense, old world European sense, but it also held sway in Boston and New York, where newspapers devoted long passages to describing in detail the ladies' dresses worn at various occasions. Isabella usually made that list. Beauty, impeccable taste, knowledge of art and music gave a woman the ability to command a room, but this is not to be confused with the political power, the focus of feminist activists of the day, such as Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucy Stone, and Isabella's friend Julia Ward Howe, who were demanding equality in the public sphere. Fashion worked for Isabella in a more private way, as a means to conceal her tender side and shield her from hurt. She'd had terrible losses and had been badly stung by Boston's founding families who set so many of the rules she chafed against. Yes, By this point, she was more a part of things than she was in the first years of her marriage. Even so, her forward-leaning tilt still cast shadows. Some people didn't like all that push and intensity, thought she was far too much of an individual. As she kept her inmost feelings largely to herself, a divide widened. There was the high-spirited, flamboyant persona which she put on much like she wore her Marie Antoinette coat, but also someone engaged in a deep, ambitious pursuit of knowledge and beauty. The first was legible, easy to caricature, and thus set aside. The latter was hidden, but far more threatening to the status quo. Her flamboyance, what she became so well known for, was in the end less subversive than what she would accomplish with Fenway Court. The two portraits of Isabella around this time capture something of this duality. The painter Dennis Bunker composed this one. He was 27 years old, had studied in Paris, but it's not his best work. Stagey and inert. Even so, he did capture Isabella's straight-ahead, confident posture and the opulence of her Venetian gown. The second image of Isabella is a photograph of her sitting in a modest black chair, this time turned away, as if the viewer was coming into the room behind her. It's not known who took the photograph. Isabella liked crowded interiors with a lot of chairs nearby and walls covered with paintings and prints. A white marble statue of a woman is clearly visible in the corner. She is using a portable writing desk, which she could fold up and take with her from house to house. The desk kept her correspondence in one place and was supplied with her stationery and favorite pens. Here she wrote out her many lists and kept up with writing cards and letters. There's an underlying seriousness to this image, something missed by many around her. She was a woman at work. On Monday, December 5, 1892, Belle and Jack left their rooms at the Hotel Westminster for a leisurely lunch at the nearby Café de Paris. From there, they traveled by carriage to the premier auction house in all of France, the Hôtel de Rowe, in a crowded neighborhood of busy shops. Up for sale that day was an important, well-known collection of Dutch art. The de Rowe had been established in 1852 and was housed in a broken-down building of cream-colored stone, which had been sullied and defaced by the smoke and storms of urban life. There, anything that could be sold was sold. Wines, pictures, old clothes, machinery, even stage scenery from local theaters was broken up and offered at auction. The rooms were bustling, crowded with people from every social rank, and sales of finer items occurred on the upper floors. Belle had bought a pair of elegant 18th century silver goblets at the de Rowe the previous May, but the December auction would be on a wholly different scale. The collector and French critic Torberger had done more than anyone to revive the reputation of the 17th century Delft painter Johannes Vermeer, who had fallen out of favor earlier in the century. 59 paintings, the core of the collection, were now on view in the large sale room. Isabella would have seen Rembrandt's, Steen's, and the exquisite Goldfinch by Rembrandt's student Karel Fabritas, the painting Torberger most liked to gaze upon at the end of his day. The auction catalog listed 5 works by Vermeer. Belle chose a luminescent painting measuring just 25 by 28 inches, aptly titled The Concert. It depicted a scene both familiar and dear to her heart, a musical performance in a private home. Isabella arranged with her regular Paris agent a scheme whereby she, a woman, could participate in the auction discreetly. That day, she sat directly outside the sales room in a spot where he could see her. To signal interest in an object, she was to hold her white handkerchief over her mouth, pull it away when she wanted out of the bid. The bidding was brisk. There was a lot to sell that day. Did her heart race a little as the price went up and up? Did she have a limit in mind, one she didn't want to exceed? She got her painting for 29,000 francs, or $6,000, outmaneuvering far more experienced bidders. Agents from London's National Gallery took home a pair of Vermeers, and the small goldfinch sold for 5,500 francs. By this point in her life, Isabella had amassed a sizable collection of many kinds of beautiful objects, placing them with care in her homes. Thomas Russell Sullivan, playwright of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, remembered in a journal entry dated February 6, 1891, and he's describing this room, photographed here. Quote, "Lunch today with Mrs. J.L. Gardner in her boudoir. It is filled with rare and beautiful things from every clime. Above the wainscot is a frieze of portrait heads, early Italian, 30 in all. A Dutch landscape, all gold and red and brown, is let into the wall over the fireplace. The hangings are priceless, Chinese and Indian, from imperial looms." She was already skilled in casting a spell with her surroundings, creating moods and feelings and experiences. During their visit, Isabella gestured to Sullivan, saying, "Everything here is a remembrance." The scene, the purchasing, having, arranging, and admiring, all of it was filled with memories of chasing beauty. But with the Vermeer purchase, Isabella stepped through a kind of portal. She became a collector. Hers was the first Vermeer brought to Boston and the second to America. Its acquisition confirmed, most of all to her, that now she had formidable expertise in choosing art. Her many discussions with John Singer Sargent and James McNeill Whistler over dinner and in the painter's Paris and London studios, her tutorials with Charles Eliot Norton, her book collecting and travels, her long hours at the Louvre and the Prado and London's National Gallery, and her conversations with Henry James. All these had prepared her for this moment, to trust her eye, to be confident in her taste, to buy the object and painting she wanted. Object after object, arranged in a room, like word after word on a page, would speak what she could not or did not choose to say aloud. And then I have just three more paragraphs. It'll go really quickly. Right from the prologue. On September 14, 1922, an especially warm day, the painter John Singer Sargent paid a visit to Fenway Court, where Isabella Stewart Gardner, now 82 years old, lived on the 4th floor as she had since the museum's opening almost 20 years earlier. He knew the palace well. The two had been friends since Henry James introduced them in 1886. 2 years after that, Sargent's large oil portrait of her, with its ropes of pearls and show of milky arms, scandalized Boston's elite Brahmin society, much to her delight. She invited the painter to live and work for a month at her museum after its opening, which he did using the 3rd floor Gothic room as his studio. She collected a number of his works, including the extraordinary theatrical El Jaleo, with its life-size dancer in mid-step, seemingly ready to sweep across the entire south wall of the 1st floor Spanish cloister. Now Sargent asked to paint his friend's portrait again. He did so quickly in the span of a morning's visit. This is the last picture of her standing with, and that's Sargent with her. A debilitating stroke in 1919 had paralyzed Isabella's right side. Though she managed to dress every day and was able to sit upright, her life had been much changed. She used the hydraulic elevator that she had installed decades before to travel from her fourth-floor apartment to spend time with her magnificent art collection on the lower floors of the palace. She liked to sit in her office, the McKnight Room, on the first floor, surrounded by artwork made by her contemporaries, men and women both, with her books and travel mementos near at hand. Here, she received visitors and welcomed Sargent, who brought along his paints. Sargent's composition, entitled Mrs. Gardner in White, is a harmony of color and pattern, suggested with light washes of color. Isabella is seated on a sofa against red striped pillows, swathed head to foot in a shroud-like white fabric that frames her face and hides her crippled hand and right side. The painter's genius for depicting draped fabric is on full display. The watercolor painting has, quote, the both clarity and mystery, to borrow Combe-Toibin's precise phrase for what characterizes Sargent's best portraits. Sargent also catches a quality of Isabella's observable since childhood, a powerful force of feeling. If her body and limbs are still, her eyes hum and buzz with life. She had seen much, searing loss, but also accomplishment and great beauty. Margaret Chandler, a friend, thought it, quote, a wonderful sketch of her in this last stage, pale and frail and dominating to the end, noting how her green eyes had lost none of their bright malice, seeing, appreciating, appraising. Sargent pictures Isabella in the here and now, even as her garment references what is to come. But he also renders something of a surprise. In his masterpiece of old age and impending death, he does not forget youth, her youth. A woman's bright lip and cascade of dark, curly hair is just visible in the shadow on the pillow behind the sitter's left shoulder. The image in the shadow is as unmistakable as it is provocative. It is as if Sargent is saying that even the ravages of age cannot dim the vitality of who Isabella once was, who she still is. This, then, is her story. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Wow. Thank you. Thank you so much.
You're very, very kind. We're just, the whole staff from fifth floor down, thrilled you're here. We feel very much a sort of almost parental, maternal pride in our girl coming home. In fact, I've spent now a week reading this wonderful book. I've been infused by the spirit of Isabella Stewart Gardner, and in that spirit, I feel like I want to say extravagantly, we are here to celebrate the two remarkable achievements by two remarkable women, Isabella Stewart Gardner and you, because this is truly a remarkable experience.
Oh, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. That is very kind. That
Well,
is very
I
kind.
wouldn't say it because it's too extravagant, but there we go. I dare it. All right. So, in this biography seminar, in the spirit of that, we're going to, our time together, we're going to spend a little bit talking about the craft of biography. Not only is it part of what we really do in the seminar series, but I always feel, especially with our audiences here, that we just have a lot of incipient historians and biographers. So everybody wants to know your secrets. I also thought it was I had an occasion to hear you speak a little bit about writing this book, and I thought it was interesting, as befits a book about art, that the idea of shape was really important to you. Can you talk a little bit about shape, especially when it came to chapters?
That's a great question, Catherine. Thank you. Shape was important. It was important to her,
Right.
right? The galleries, the way the galleries were shaped, the sequence of the galleries. That's an interesting, the deluge of material. Where's Shayna? Can I see? Yes. Yes. The scale of the sources, right? So how do you not get overwhelmed? And I
Right.
did get overwhelmed. But I started to think about how I could have chapters have a shape, maybe like an object on a mantelpiece, and have those chapters be somewhat different, right? So that you're entering into the chapter in somewhat different ways, also like you enter into rooms in somewhat different ways. That just gave me a sort of way to manage that feeling of being overwhelmed. And then you're always making choices of what you include and not include, right? And with her archive, you're always trying to figure out those telling details and those sort of vivid phrases as much as you can. And so that's not quite, I found shapes of paragraphs are important, right? The way
Yes.
they look on the page, but also then what they contain. So yeah, shape was very important to how I thought about it.
Yeah,
Because it was important to her. I want to say one more
yes.
detail, which
Yeah.
is that I had a chance to be in the Barbaro in Venice. It was just by chance. It was the Biennale, and there was an event there, and my research assistant and I were walking around, and she spoke Italian, thankfully. And they said, come in, and we couldn't believe it. And so we were able to walk through the galleries at the rooms at the Palazzo Barbaro, and it was so striking that the shape of those rooms were so similar to Fenway Court. And it also is the angle of vision that you're looking at the paintings, right? When you go to the Gardner, you're often looking up, right? And so so too at the Barbaro. And I was like, that cannot be a coincidence. And then there was in the archive, in Jack's handwriting, that he had taken measurements of the doorways in the Palazzo Barbaro.
Oh.
So then you know that they're paying attention to the shape as well.
Because your chapters it's so interesting. The chapters are generally shorter than you would think in a book as big as this. But they're also they're shorter and different lengths.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Very
I was
similar.
very influenced by Bob Richardson, the great Bob Richardson.
yes, of
and
course.
he always said short chapters. They're
Yeah.
right? Because it's a way you can have your arms around it. Otherwise, chapters can get away from you.
But it kind of mirrored her movement style, too.
Yes.
Yes, which was very much.
Yes.
Yeah,
Yes.
absolutely. We only have a couple of minutes. I just looked at the time because we need to get the wisdom of the crowd out here. But I want to say something about the pictures, which is kind of extraordinary. So it's a big book. It's very conventional looking, and it has, as you would imagine, this center section with the lovely, high-quality, glossy pictures and lovely colors. Absolutely. But what's so interesting is what you did with illustrations throughout the book. And I'm going to find an example here while suddenly you'll see this, and there's no captions underneath, nothing like that. Can you talk a little bit about your choice about how you decided to put the illustrations in the book?
Thank you to my editor and Mariner Books that we were able to publish as many, and also to the museum for their extraordinary generosity and permissions to publish that many illustrations and for that astounding cover image. But that was a very big challenge. I think I didn't want the book to read like a guide to the museum,
Right,
because
exactly.
there had been a beautifully written guide in 2017 to the museum. And so I needed to somehow visually distinguish it from the museum's color pictures of the galleries. And there's this extraordinary photographer, Thomas Marr, she had hired to photograph every single gallery, right?
Right,
So the
right.
will states you cannot move objects, and so she hired a photographer to have visual evidence of where she had put things. And those were amazing photographs. I showed a lot of them today,
Yeah.
and suddenly it felt like that's a really great visual accompaniment because I was writing about the building of Fenway Court, which was the name before her death in 1924 when it became Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum.
But the pictures are woven into the text, so you're reading the text and you go, "I'd love to see that," and you realize it's right there. Yeah, I mean, it's great.
And we had to make some changes, and then you got to make sure that image is next to the prose that it needs to be next to. Yeah, those are fantastic production editors at Mariner Books. Yeah, brava, yeah.
But we do want to get folks out here because I'm sure people have questions. So is somebody coming around with a... Yes, I think we have a question right there. Thanks, Sarah.
Usually when one thinks of Mrs. Gardner, especially because the museum is an art museum, one thinks of all the paintings. But I think that during her lifetime, she did a lot with music as well.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could comment on her connection between the musical community here in Boston.
Yes, incredibly important to her story. In fact, she loved music as much as she loved paintings. There's the music curator at the museum, George Steele, is so eloquent about this. And she, of course, was a member of the Boston Symphony Orchestra, founding member with great friends with Henry Higginson, and she also subscribed to the Boston Opera. She also she had all these performances at Fenway Court for young musicians, giving them a chance to have audiences. And some of those names are like Charles Loeffler she supported. George Proctor was a pianist. There's just so many musicians in her story. It's all the five senses. So it's not only what you see, but it's also what you hear. And so she had birds in cages, right, for opening night, so you could hear that bird song, music. Boston Symphony Orchestra came to play at opening night, right? There were, the museum doesn't look like it did when she first opened it in 1903. There was a 2-story music hall where the Spanish cloister is now and the tapestry room on that side of the museum. And so there were a lot of young musicians that had their premiere there. Can you imagine? Mm-hmm. It would be so, yeah. And she sometimes, there was one performance, I think it was of Charles Loeffler's, I think it's a pagan poem, or I'm blanking on the title of the composition. But she had trumpets standing on the galleries, right? So people could hear that far off trumpet sound. So yeah, she was. One more detail about the music. She had, after her stroke, young musicians would come and play piano, and she at one point said, "Oh no, don't play that. I have a memory of that performance from 20 years ago, and I don't want it to be ruined."
I love it. I wonder, do we have a question online that we could actually do? We've got hundreds of people, may I say, online, and we're so happy to have you all from all across the country and the world.
Thank you for coming online.
Yes. In your pajamas, very wise, very wise.
Yes.
Jeffrey asks, please say more about her relationship with Bernard Berenson.
Oh, the
Mr.
complicated
Berenson.
relationship with Berenson. I found it ultimately a very moving story because she kept her friendship the rest of her life. So he was 20 years younger than she, I think it was 20 years, and she sponsored his travel overseas when he graduated from Harvard. So he first wanted to pursue literature and then realized, oh no, I really love looking at art at all these wonderful European museums. And so she funded that travel with some other families. And then they fell out of communication. We don't know if the letters are just lost but he comes back in the 1890s after he's written his great masterpiece on the Italian Renaissance drawings, Florentine drawings. And now he has expertise in the Italian Renaissance, and she is becoming an art collector. So they needed each other. And it's the only it's the only correspondence that's published in her collection. I guess there's a small book of Henry James' letters to her as well. But it's a big, fat, wonderful collection of their letters back and forth. So Berenson did not burn her letters, even though she asked people to burn her letters, because he knew her fame, he needed her fame, and vice versa.
Right. Even when it turned out he may have been actually sort of
Yes, not entirely candid, shall we say, about prices and dealings and
His cut.
his cut, 5%, and he had colleagues in England saying, you have to tell her the truth. And one summer he went to bed because he was so stressed out about this that she would find out, and Jack was very suspicious. Very suspicious. He did not like this. That was hard to untangle all the different, because there's so many stories that have grown up around it, and then it's sort of like figuring out what is the thing I can stand on that I know for sure.
Right.
Right?
And also
So-
the issue of denial. I think
Yes,
we
right.
probably, right, I'm wanting not to know. We
Yes.
might have, I think, time for one more question out here in this group of, I always like to think future historians or biographers.
Yes. Come to
Yeah.
the MHS. Come to the MHS.
Oh, do you have another one from,
We can do one from online.
Sure.
Heather asks, did the two subjects of your biographies ever meet? Were Clover and Isabella friends?
What a
Heather,
nice
that was
question.
one of my questions. Yes, thank
yes, they did. And Clover thought she was a lot of work. So Clover was about 3 years younger, and there's this great scene of after Henry and Clover moved to Washington from Boston, and Mrs. Gardner comes to town, to Washington, and she can see Mrs. Gardner walking across on the street through her, Clover can see her on the street walking, and she says to her father in the letter, perhaps if I invite all the ambassadors and all the senators I can, maybe that will be enough for her. She also gives me, Clover gives me the great line in the book, calls her a Beacon Streeter. So, and I kind of took on Clover's attitude to Mrs. Gardner. It was really turning to Henry Adams's letter later, because Henry thought she was fabulous.
Yeah.
And that was just, and I was like, he thought she was so fascinating. And you can see his letters about her upstairs in the gallery room. Not to be missed, I might add. And so that they had different opinions of her.
Yeah, but it's so interesting about, because you write about Clover, and I hope you got to hear the sort of spontaneous applause when you mentioned your book. It's just a wonderful book. And you got to sort of go back into that world.
I did.
Which is kind of interesting.
I did.
But
it's an utterly different story.
Yes.
Clover's
such a
Clover's
different-
story goes like this. It comes to a close. And,
Yes.
and it ends in a kind of darkness.
Yes.
And her life sort of closes in. I used to call it a chamber piece. And Isabella is full-on orchestra with multiple choirs, and it's the cover of the book. It goes just the opposite way. And I think I was so drawn to someone like that after
Yes.
probably living with, I cared about Clover enormously.
Of course.
But it was so interesting to have I remember thinking during the pandemic, I was glad that I had Isabella in my
Yes.
mind, in my imagination. She was an optimist.
Well, I have to say, you could read this. There's a therapeutic part, which is that she comes into her own. You call her a late bloomer.
Yes.
So, but she opens up, and you just did that beautiful, like, to the world.
Yes.
She becomes to the world. And
Yes.
it really starts taking off in her 30s and 40s and 50s and
She's
60s.
ravenous. She's ravenous, not only for paintings and music, but people and experiences and book. It's just, it goes on and on. She's just ravenous for the world.
I know.
And it's her eye, I always think, that saved her. Right? Think of being a doctor telling you you can have no more children. You're on Beacon Street.
Right.
I had a research student identify all the houses on Beacon Street nearby and how many kids they had, because I
Oh,
wanted to
gosh.
picture, I wanted to see how many kids were running up and down Beacon Street to the public garden and the common. And I thought, well, at 26, now what? What do you do?
But she had the gift.
But she,
Yeah.
it was hard.
Yeah.
But her eye really saved her life. And that curiosity and a kind of fearlessness, it's incredible. I still find it incredibly moving story in
and
that
a
way.
real inspiration to people over 50 is all I want to say.
Yes,
I should say that
exactly
now.
right. Exactly right.
Well, listen, thank you so much. You've given us something incredibly special.
Oh, thank
Thank
you.
you so much.
Oh,
Everybody,
thank you
just
to the
one more time,
MHS.
thank
Oh
you
my
so
gosh.
much.
Oh my gosh. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.
Oh.
It's a very special place.
All right. we're going to take
All
ourselves
right.
that.
Thank you, Dr. Dykstra, for sharing your work with us today. Audience here, please remain seated until Dr. Dykstra has had an opportunity to get settled for the book signing. If you've not picked up a copy of the book, you can do that at that point as well. It's great spring break reading if people are traveling in the next couple of weeks. As I mentioned at the start of this program, the event tonight was part of the New England Biography Series, and that's part of the discussions that are led by the research department here. Visit our website to learn more about what is coming up, and while you are there, consider becoming a member of the MHS to support our ongoing mission from the very start to collect, preserve, and communicate the building blocks of the past for the present and future generations. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's go join our author.